So the discipline is ended. The leash is off. March out. Take the wall defenses. Take the reserves and rally them. They will be blind and deaf out there soon, and so will need a leader. Sigismund nodded again. No other soul would have noticed it, but there was something other than the usual dutifulness in his eyes just then. Something like hunger. Any specific objectives, Lord? He asked. At that, Dorn almost laughed. Not from humor, just from emptiness. The caustic recognition of what would come next. He had given everything. He was already empty, drained to a husk, and the hardest test still lay ahead. The lion had not come. Gilliman and Russ had not come. They were out of time, out of luck, and what remained now was only defiance. Only bloody-minded, bloody-handed defiance. No. I set you free, my beloved, my best son, said Rogal Dorn, never taking his eyes off his first captain. Do now what you were made to do. He smiled a second time, the expression as icy as the despair that gripped his heart. Hurt them. Rogal Dorn has some truly excellent speeches in the Siege of Terra. I remember reading that one for the first time, felt really good, because as much as I love Sigismund and Dorn's relationship in the Horus Heresy, it is truly heartbreaking. Initially in the Great Crusade, Sigismund was regarded by Dorn with a significant amount of favour and trust. Sigismund was not just the first captain of the Imperial Fist's Legion, Dorn refers to his son as his strong right arm, and Sigismund's reputation as potentially the greatest Space Marine Blade Master to have ever existed is well known, unless of course Sevatar cheats again. However, Sigismund's relationship with his father took a massive hit in the Horus Heresy. After Dorn learned of his brother's treachery, he tasked Sigismund with leading the Retribution fleet to the Istvan system. However, ultimately, and out of character, Sigismund actually requested not to continue on this task, but instead he requested to return to Terra with his father. It wasn't until much later that Sigismund revealed to his father the true reason he had made this request, and it all came as a result of a fated meeting with Euphrates Keeler. It was not what she told me, it was just what she made me see. Sigismund paused, remembering Keeler's face. You must decide, she had said, and there had been sorrow in her voice. The war will come to Terra, said Sigismund. You must choose, she had said. He had been about to tell her to return to her quarters, to keep her falsehoods to herself. You must choose your future and the future of your legion, Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists. Her words had held him in place. Fear filled him, forgotten and alien in its raw intensity. You must choose where to stand, by the words of your duty, or by your father's side, at the end. The end of what? He managed to say. The end of everything that has been, she had said. As she spoke, Sigismund seemed to see what she spoke of. So many ships that the sky was iron. Fire falling like monsoon rain. Armoured bodies heaped as high as the titans that strode amongst them. Hundreds of thousands of enemies, millions, an uncountable horde surging through the broken walls. An angel, its wings red in the firelight of a burning palace. Imperial fists tumbling from blackened walls, falling like water, broken, bloody. Columns of smoke so tall that they could touch the armoured sky. And still they come. Ships blasting dead wrecks aside to scatter more troops to the surface. You must understand what it will come to, she had said. As she spoke, he had known it was true. The universe was war without end. The Imperium had turned on itself, and so it was only a matter of time before everything rested on a single battle, on a sword's edge. What is the other path? He had asked. She had shaken her head. Death, Sigismund. Death and sacrifice far away, under the light of an unknown star, alone and unremembered. She had gone, leaving him alone in a silent corridor. It was this vision that started Sigismund on his journey towards believing in the divinity of the Master of Mankind. Euphrates Keeler herself was part of the burgeoning imperial cult, and she would go on to become the first imperial saint. Naturally, Dorn is furious when he finds out Sigismund's reasoning here, not only because he's denied a direct order essentially, but also because he thinks Euphrates Keeler has really corrupted and ruined his first captain. Dorn believed it was just Sigismund's pride and superstition that led him to believe Euphrates Keeler, who he believed to be a charlatan and a demigod who peddled lies. As a Primarch, a son of the Emperor, he of course associated her and her superstition and cult as something that was against his father's ideals, and something that the Imperial Fists had literally fought against many times in the Great Crusade. Dorn viewed Sigismund's decision not only as a failure to perform his assigned duty out amongst the stars, but also as a profound ideological betrayal. He believed Sigismund was acting out of pessimism and arrogance, presuming to see more clearly than his father or even the Emperor, and he literally tells Sigismund that he is murdering the future. For Dorn, the Primarchs and their sons were made to serve, their existence having no other meaning, with no luxury of choice or the right to rule their own destinies. The will of his sons is meant to be his, and through him, the Emperor's. In contrast to that first clip, in the Horus Heresy, Rogal Dorn actually tells Sigismund that he is not Sigismund's father, and Sigismund is no longer his son. Further evidence to the fact that 40k is basically just daddy issues in space. What's quite funny, of course, is that with the heresy ongoing, Dorn can't really afford to make his legion look too weak, so he has to be very careful in how he punishes Sigismund, because he can't fully demote him, he can't kick him out of the legion, because of course this will be a weakness within his legion that the traitors will then be able to exploit. So he tells Sigismund that Sigismund's punishment is for him to handle alone. Dorn actually tells Sigismund that the Legion and the Imperium will never know of his judgment, and Sigismund's duty will be to never let your weakness taint those who have more strength and honor than you. Of course, this command didn't really last, as post the Horus Heresy, Sigismund would go on to be the first chapter master or high marshal of the Black Templars chapter, a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists, who are entirely devoted to serving the God Emperor of mankind. And typically, Space Marines do not view the Emperor as a god, believing in the Imperial truth that there are no gods. That's a very brief summary of these two's relationship, and it's a really good one to read if you want to check it out for yourself. But interestingly, in modern Warhammer 40k lore, we've had a development. So in the recent Fulgrim book that came out, we actually see a Black Templar named Berengar have a vision, and as we know, Black Templars having visions always goes well, and in this vision he actually sees his Primarch, Rogal Dorn. Johannes Berengar of the Black Templars was at prayer when the vision came upon him, head bowed before the great golden statue of the God Emperor in the Battle Cruiser's chapel, hands in their black ceramite-powered gauntlets folded on the pommel of his greatsword. And in a single instant, the world changed. Gone was the chapel with its grey marble pillars, the vaulted ceiling, and the blank-eyed cherubium trailing devotional parchments. Gone the servitorized doves singing in their almost human voices. Gone the chanting rows of warriors proclaiming their devotion beneath the chaplain's watchful eye. Instead, he stood on a battlefield that stretched around him from horizon to horizon, trumpets pealing out a fanfare to usher in the end of days. The armor he wore was not his own, nor the forge-blackened blade bound to his wrist with iron chains. A single blood-red ruby had been set in the hilt, reflecting the burning skies and returning it 1,000-fold, shattering his helmeted reflection into 1,000 pieces like the squares on a regicide board. Golden light flared in his vision. Above him, women clad in glittering raiment swooped through the air on metal wings, their jump packs trailing clouds of incense. Holy warriors strode forward at his side, some in the same black and white vestments as him, but draped across armor of ancient and priceless design. And there, was the Primarch himself, a vast figure in sun-bright armor marching at the head of the war host, and Berengar picked up his pace to match, every muscle and sinew longing to spill blood at his Genefather's side. "My son." The voice reverberated in Berengar's skull so loud it banished all other thoughts. Was it Dorn who addressed him, or Sigismund, the first High Marshal of his chapter? What hand had plucked him from prayer and brought him here, to this eternal battlefield? Already that other life was fading into grey insignificance. Why he had been called here no longer mattered. There was only the thunder of the war drums, the bright song of the trumpets, and the spilling of heretic blood in the God Emperor's name. "I am yours to command, my lord," he cried. The enemies were close now, a formless horde of shifting figures that resolved from a flowing mass of inhuman flesh, taking on the semblance of humanity before losing it again. Light played across it in a shifting iridescent tide, and a sudden fierce joy swelled in Berengar's hearts. "My warrior." The booming voice again, skull-splittingly loud, unmistakably divine. He drove the huge black sword through an oncoming wave of capering figures, slicing through flesh no more substantial than air, sending them collapsing to the ground in a spray of violet ichor. The golden light shone down on him like a blessing, filling not only his eyes, but his soul too, warming the blood in his veins with holy purpose. It was a beacon, a guide, coalescing in the center of the battlefield, taking shape around a figure that refused to commit itself to a single form. A faceless incarnation that seemed to lose cohesion each time he tried to look directly upon it. The Neverborn were an endless ocean. The Sons of Dorn were warriors without peer. But for every foe they cut down, every foe he cut down, another dozen took its place. In the corner of his eye, he watched as the first of his brethren stumbled and fell, then another and another, dragged down and slaughtered by countless grasping hands. The formless horror in the center of the battle line threw back its head and gave a mellifluous peal of laughter. "No pity." Was it Dorn himself who led the battle cry? Berengar added his own voice to the answering roar and joined the charge. "No remorse. No mercy." The shapeless horror opened its arms in greeting, and with dreamlike clarity, Berengar realized what he had taken for a man-sized enemy was 3, 4 times as large. No, 10, a dozen. Looming over him with bladed arms unfolding, the great coil of a serpent's belly, where a man's legs would have been rising before him like a pillar of meat and scales. An uncannily beautiful face looked down on him and fixed him with a brilliant smile. "My champion." The voice lanced through his head again, and flame filled his veins. A warrior stepped from the enemy ranks, resplendent in the armor of the 3rd Legion, a blade glowing purple in his hands. His identity was hidden by a golden helm surmounted with a magnificent feathered plume, its visor wrought in the likeness of a cruel and beautiful face. The battlefield receded around them. Even the monstrous figure somehow faded in Berengar's mind as the Blade Master raised his sword and swept it down in a warrior's salute. "Brother," the warrior said. This traitor was an affront to all that was holy. The God Emperor was with him. His duty was clear. Johannes Berengar drew the black sword in both hands and plunged it straight towards his enemy's heart. So is it possible that the great Rogal Dorn could return to the Imperium and maybe even lead the Black Templars chapter? In terms of the passage itself, it is, as I stated, a vision, and there is a suggestion in the story that this vision could have just been a manipulation tactic by Fulgrim in order to draw the Emperor's champion Berengar to his side. When Dorn speaks to Berengar, he uses his big booming voice, but on the actual page we see bold italics, and this is standard for how the demon Primarchs usually speak in the novels. However, It is also standard for how pretty much any warp creation speaks to non-warp creations in Warhammer 40k books, so by no means is this conclusive evidence. However, the fact that the last words he says to Berengar are "my champion" certainly suggests in hindsight that this was Fulgrim, because by the end of the novel we discover that one of Fulgrim's potential plans was to draw Berengar into the Emperor's Children and have him be his champion instead of the Emperor's champion, a plan that naturally fails. But the truthfulness of the vision is by no means the most interesting part of this story for me, as I am far more concerned with the idea of what Rogal Dorn will do when he returns to the Imperium, and of course he finds out that the Black Templars are perhaps the greatest Space Marine chapter in the Imperium in terms of the number of Marines that they have, but also the fact that they are still devout worshippers of the God Emperor. When looking at the Siege of Terra, there's a few things I think that are important to bear in mind. Firstly, when Sigismund becomes the Emperor's champion, it seems very clear to me that he does so at the bequest of the Emperor, essentially. Sigismund acquired his black sword as part of some honor gifts bestowed by the Chosen of Sigillite for him to use. This included mastercrafted armor of Executioner Black and, of course, a huge black blade. Hassan, a Chosen of Malkador, explicitly says to Sigismund that this black blade is for him from the Emperor. And upon holding the blade, the first captain has a strong reaction, a sense of revulsion and awe upon gazing at the black hilt, finding the damned thing almost seducing. Sigismund's brother even thinks that the blade itself may be witchery, and undoubtedly it is in some way because, of course, the Emperor had a hand in its creation. This is a really important fact to remember when talking about Sigismund and Dorn, because the one thing about Rogal Dorn above everything else is his loyalty to the Master of Mankind and his belief that the Emperor's word is law. So if, post the Horus Heresy, Sigismund goes to his Genefather and says that the Emperor has made him his champion, then Rogal Dorn, in my opinion, will likely accept this. And the Emperor's Champion is an interesting title as well, because Rogal Dorn himself notes that this was his title in the past, so it's likely that the Emperor chose this title because he knew that it would mean something to his son. The other really important thing to bear in mind, in my opinion, is Rogal Dorn's changing relationship with the idea of faith throughout the Siege of Terra. By no means is it static, and his understanding of the Arcana, for example, eventually saved the Imperium of Man. So of course, originally, Rogal Dorn hated the idea of faith, believed that Sigismund should have never listened to Euphrati Kila. However, throughout the siege, he is willing to listen to Malkador and Remembrances and others as they talk about the idea of faith and how it could be used as a weapon against the enemy, and then of course, he meets the Chaos God Khorne. After he teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit, Dorn was separated from the Emperor and Sanguinius and Constantine Valdor and everyone else, and he found himself in an endless yellow desert, feeling that there was no way out. During this time, which for him was a century or even centuries, he was alone, and in order to keep himself sane, he meticulously ordered the facts around him so he could be certain of each day, but experienced tremendous pain and suffering. The desert itself slowly became red, and Dorn became taunted by something he called the Red, which wanted him to utter a phrase, and we know that phrase to be blood for the blood god. Nonetheless, Dorn stays true, does not give in to the temptations of the blood god, does not give in to the fact that the bodies of his dead sons are strewn around him. He stays true, he repeats to himself, "I am Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, seventh found son, defiant and unyielding," and he talks back to Khorne, actually boring the blood god essentially, using his knowledge of history and philosophy of warfare, discussing concepts of just and unjust killing. It's fantastic to think how much that sentence alone must have just really annoyed Khorne. And right at the end of his tenure in the desert, Khorne is really pressing Rogal Dorn to utter those words that will bring him into the blood god's service, blood for the blood god. But Dorn eventually declares, "There are no gods, not even you." We can be pretty sure by the end of the Horus Heresy that Rogal Dorn still doesn't believe in gods, and by extension doesn't believe his own father is a god. But Rogal Dorn does see a lot. He literally meets a god of the warp, and his understanding of the Arcana, as I say, basically ends up saving the Imperium. So once he finds his father's body, as we talked about in my Litu video, Dorn sees these kind of tarot cards strewn about the room, and we know that these cards are kind of left over from one of the Emperor's battles with Horus. And like, Litu was kind of looking at these cards thinking that they mean something, and Rogal Dorn's never really put stock in the Imperial Tarot, even though Malcador gave him readings throughout the Heresy. However, because of Litu's suggestions, Rogal Dorn starts to think, actually, maybe Litu's right. Maybe these cards mean something that are strewn around this room, and maybe this is the last way my father can communicate with me. And from these cards, he understands that he must put his father onto the Golden Throne, and that ends up saving the Imperium. Now, the concept of a Rogal Dorn who believes in the Imperial Tarot is in and of itself a massive change to what we see in the Great Crusade. Great Crusade Rogal Dorn it's not reading the Imperial Tarot, and I think this is the difference that we're going to see in Warhammer 40k. At a certain point, the concept of what is a god is sort of semantics. You know, there's a discussion in the Dark Imperium series in the final book, Godblight, where Guilliman's speaking to a Grey Knight and an Eldar Farseer about what counts as a god in Warhammer 40k and whether there are gods. And I think Rogal Dorn, being a pragmatist, is actually going to sort of understand that what has happened is that the Emperor has ascended to become something that it talks like a god, it acts like a god, it creates Imperial Saints like a god. You know, what's really the difference here? And so I like to think that when you combine that with the fact that we've seen this huge story from Dorn telling Sigismund that Sigismund is not his son, to the end of the Horus Heresy in Warhawk, where Dorn tells Sigismund that Sigismund is his best son, and we get that really kind of heartwarming moment where he seems to kind of accept what Sigismund has become, as we saw at the start of the video. I think when you combine these things together, you get a pretty compelling case for Rogal Dorn actually being able to come back and basically accept the Black Templars for what they are. Because I imagine he's going to have some philosophical differences, but I don't believe he's going to be as angry as you might expect. One of the things I've spoken about before on the channel is when we bear in mind what Dorn went through in the desert, being tormented by Khorne for centuries, with the fact that the Iron Cage, from the little lore we have on it, is this kind of gigantic failure of Rogal Dorn and the Imperial Fists, which is in stark contrast to the Heresy, where Dorn's basically the only Primarch to get everything right. It sort of suggests to me that Rogal Dorn is going to go through a profound transformation, and I call it the breaking of Rogal Dorn. I think we're going to see that. My personal belief is that we're going to see a Rogal Dorn be probably the only Primarch that can actually sort of communicate with his father through the tarot cards, because certainly none of the other Primarchs will have had this understanding. And I think therefore it's pretty likely that you will see a Rogal Dorn fighting with the Black Templars in the future. I'm going to jump in chat for a second. Now, one other thing I have to mention, so one of the things we've been playing around with is to make these streams a little bit more interactive. We've got a new feature where if you are a part of the Discord, it's a members Discord, but anyone can join it. You just won't get access to the members area. You can join one of the voice channels for live chat, and if you do so, then I can kind of admit you, and then you can ask a question live on the air, as it were, because this is a proper live stream and not the kind of live stream where I talk for 5 minutes whilst my mic is muted. That definitely didn't happen today. But yeah, so if you fancy doing that, do stay tuned.
There'll be a link to the Discord in the description, by the way. So let me just jump in chat for a bit then, talk to some people before we get to that. Hello, everybody. Some people think Rogal Dorn isn't coming back. I mean, let's talk about that just for a second. It's an understandable belief because, of course, Rogal Dorn was dead. However, he has been... The lore around Rogal Dorn not being dead, to be honest, is pretty clear. Let's put aside Vulcan's comments in the Beast Arises series. Let's put aside the fact that, you know, people have had visions of Rogal Dorn returning. Rogal Dorn's just not dead in Warhammer 40k lore. So there are two pieces of evidence that typically come up. One, in the old Warhammer 40k lore, it was said that the Imperial Fists had his body. Games Workshop deliberately changed that. They changed it to now they only have, I think they changed it to originally him having two fists. They had two of Rogal Dorn's fists, and now they only have one fist. The only reason you would make this change is so that it's very obvious that Rogal Dorn has survived in some way, leaving the door open. If you wanted to leave Rogal Dorn dead, you just wouldn't make this change. It doesn't make any sense for me to kind of read that change in the lore and then still believe that Dorn is dead. Do you see what I'm saying? And then the other thing, of course, is Konrad Curze's vision of Rogal Dorn. So when Konrad Curze meets the Emperor, there are 4 Primarchs with the Emperor. And when he meets, I think it's Lorgar and Fulgrim, he sees the vision of them kind of turning to demon Primarchs. And when he meets Ferrus Manus and Dorn, he sees them being killed. Now, this sounds like pretty good evidence because Konrad Curze has visions, and his visions are always right, except for the fact that Konrad Curze's visions are not always right. They're actually wrong a lot of the time. That's kind of the point of his story, is that his visions are often wrong. Sometimes people say things like Konrad Curze sees the worst possible outcome. That's also not true. In his story, we just see, in his Primarch novel, we see him have visions that are just wrong. They're proven to be incorrect. Likewise, in the Horus Heresy, like kind of the key difference between Sanguinius and Konrad Curze, the thing that they argue about is the fact that Konrad Curze is convinced that his visions will come true, and Sanguinius knows that this is not the case. And Sanguinius is right in this statement, of course. And to that point, when Sanguinius ejects Konrad Curze into space instead of taking him back to Terra, this is a huge moment because it's like the moment that Sanguinius actually goes, you know what, Konrad? You're so convinced that your visions are always correct. Let's make this one true. And then he ejects him into space. And it's a brutal moment from Sanguinius. Sanguinius basically denied a 5th loyalist Primarch at the Siege of Terra, because it's very much implied that if Sanguinius had taken Konrad Curze back to Terra, the Emperor could have cured him, which is wild in and of itself. So Sanguinius actually kind of gives into Rogal Dorn, he kind of gives into Konrad Curze's taunting, and such a big moment really in the Horus Heresy. Rogal Dorn returned with the Emperor's Claw. Yeah, I did a live stream a while ago this on the channel where I talked about kind of the gifts that different Primarchs might have, because weirdly it wasn't the writers, I think it was the model designers. They have confirmed that for each Primarch that returns, they're going to return them with some weaponry from the Emperor. And of course, you know, Guilliman's got the sword, the Lion's got the shield, and so yeah, Rogal Dorn getting a claw would be pretty cool, especially if he's lost a hand. Maybe he can kind of just have a bionic in there that he can control. That would work pretty well. To be honest, one of the things that's sort of interesting to know is whether Primarchs can regrow limbs like that, because Fulgrim does regrow a limb, but he's kind of incredibly corrupted by chaos at the point. So it's not entirely clear, but I think that the concept of bringing Rogal Dorn back with a bionic hand just would look too cool. Do you know what I mean? So I kind of veer away from both, weirdly, because the claw would hide the bionic, and I've always liked bionics in 40k. I always think they look badass, and you don't get enough of them when you're building Space Marine kits. But then always jealous of the Iron Hands fans there. Do you think Rogal Dorn would come back in Nihilus or Sanctus? Oh, cool question. How would each area affect Dorn's view on the modern Imperium, and whether he meets up with Guilliman or the Lion first? Okay, so this is a wild theory, but stay tuned. So as you guys will know, one of the things I did last year is I read every book that came out, and I'm reading every book that comes out this year. One of the themes in last year was terraforming, seeding life, building planets. This came up in a few novels, and I can't help but think Games Workshop is doing this for a reason. We had a Warhammer Vault, for example, on going back to Cadia, and I can't help but wonder whether something like Cadia is going to be reformed. The Beotani and the Yandan craft worlds are going to start making new worlds to kind of reseed the Eldar Empire. I think you might see these kind of things in the future. I kind of like the idea that Rogal Dorn has to be in a very different position in 40k as to where he was in 30k. For most of what you see him in the Heresy, he's in the Sol system. Not the entire Great Crusade, but in most of the books that you actually see him, that's where he is. And that's because he is the Praetorian of Terra. He had an incredibly important role. So I quite like the idea that we do the complete opposite now, and we move him far away from Terra. And I like the idea that Rogal Dorn has a fortress world somewhere that's integral to the Imperium. Maybe it's on a planet, not Vigilus, but something like Vigilus. It could be Vigilus, and so I would put him there. And I think that would be such a good use of Rogal Dorn. Demon invasions that are unending, orcs turning up, and you've got Rogal Dorn kind of being the Praetorian of one of the most important planets in the galaxy for strategic reasons. And in that respect, he is continually fighting in the service to the Emperor. I was going to say God Emperor, but we'll stay away from that for now. But yeah, I really like this idea. I think that it would be good. I think ultimately we don't want Rogal Dorn just kind of going back to Terra and defending Terra. It's just a repeat, right? I think it would be quite boring. I want to see him far away from Terra, far away from the Emperor, and I think that would work really well. And potentially even you could have something really cool where Perturabo probably couldn't resist the challenge, draw Perturabo out to attack this fortress world, and maybe he'll make his own. And so you've got this kind of back and forth between these different worlds. That's my current plan, thinking, but that's just like a fun idea. And in terms of, I also like this plan because, being honest, you sort of have to think about Games Workshop's ability to sell models and campaigns through this. And I think this works well. I think it's pretty cool, but that's just me. But yeah, so I think you're going to see either Imperium Nihilus or something between the two. In actual fact, it wouldn't be too surprising for me to know that Dorn is already in Nihilus, as someone like Vulcan might be, and they're just defending a world somewhere. But it's cut off, of course, from both the light of the Emperor and kind of the Lion and the Blood Angels protectorate, which they've sort of established by this point, I think. Yeah, personally, I do believe that I think Rogal Dorn's return seems inevitable to me. And the main evidence I have for that is because if you take a look at the history of Black Library and Games Workshop, you will discover that they love money. And Rogal Dorn is equal to a lot of money. He's literally made of gold. And so, yeah, I think that seems inevitable that he will return. And when he returns, I think kind of, I was going to say unlike his brothers, but just as Guilliman is starting to understand the benefits of faith and the realities of faith in the Imperium, because faith fundamentally is real, I think Dorn will have a greater understanding of how faith works, why his sons, or some of his sons, believe in the divinity of the God Emperor of mankind. And I think he might come to the conclusion just to kind of let them be, let them continue doing their thing. I was going to say they're not hurting anyone, but they are hurting a lot of people, but it's generally the people they're supposed to be hurting. So that's what we want to see. And I think we could very much well see, at least for a time, what we all want to see, which is a crusading Rogal Dorn, bionic hand, maybe claw of the Emperor, chain, massive chainsword, and yeah, just cutting down his foes. And certainly don't believe in the lies of Fulgrim. And that's a wrap for today's stream. If you enjoy these kinds of Warhammer 40k lore breakdowns and discussions, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification so you don't miss me going live. For those of you who want extra content and to support the channel, consider clicking the join button. Becoming a member will give you access to more videos and streams and our Discord community, where you can chat with other lore enthusiasts and myself. Thanks again for watching, look out for any Chaos or Genestealer cults in your area, and I'll see you next time.